Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the inaugural edition of the Integration Podcast. This podcast is coming to you sort of from the Institute of Applied Metatheory, but wrapped around the Integration Journal, the Journal of Big Picture Theory and Practice. And this is an academic journal that we've launched just in the last several months at the Institute. We have a new Integration Society of Scholars that has formed around this effort. And this podcast will be dedicated to talking about the topics, concepts, key issues that come up in papers that are submitted or published, or just broader themes that need to be addressed in the scholarly community. So we welcome you to this first of its kind, and I'm joined by guys that you'll probably see a lot more of over the long term than me, Brendan Graham Dempsey and Nick Hedlund, both who are co-directors of research at the Institute, as well as play critical leadership roles at the journal itself. Brendan is the managing director, and Nick is the editor-in-chief. So, hi guys.
Hey, Rob.
Hey Rob, good to see you.
So the way we decided to do this first show was for me just to set context for a few minutes, and it's going to be a wide-ranging discussion. We actually don't have an agenda or any format, so this will be pretty wide open with whatever comes up. But I thought that an interesting place to start is to not dive into the journal itself or dive into the sort of the academic stuff quite yet, and to really just notice our global context, like just step back and think about. We're recording this. What is this? It's the 9th of January. So, in the past week, we've had the leader of Venezuela, I suppose, deposed and brought to the United States, and an entire process of regime change underway there. As we speak, the Iranian regime might be falling or not. We will see. In the last 4 hours, the European Union has just instantiated what is in effect the largest free trade bloc in the world now by executing free trade agreements with Mercosur, which is Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina, with probably Bolivia on the way. And that's been on the table for decades, but this has all been catalyzed recently by recent events. What all of these things have in common, and of course, this is just like week one of 2026. What all these things have in common is what we call social morphogenesis, which is a kind of a geeky term for the notion that with the state of technology, with the state of our political systems, with the state of our leadership and governance systems, with the state of our overall power systems throughout the world, what we get is we get change that accelerates on change. So now change is creating nonlinear rates of additional change. And that is digging up the deep structures of the world quickly. And this is likely to be a life condition that we are continuing to encounter for some time, because the technological arcs aren't slowing down. The world's institutional structures that were fit for purpose for the 20th century are not yet adapting the way they need to this rate of change, and to the fragmentation of how we know, the fragmentation of knowledge, the epistemic fragmentation, the values fragmentation. They're just having a very hard time keeping up. In fact, we've argued, and certainly others have too, that institutions are not designed to keep up. Like institutional learning cycles and the way they metabolize change and then put in place policies in order to adapt to change is far longer than what you might say reality is doing in terms of its change cycles. So the amount of learning you need to do to adapt is far quicker than what institutions are capable of these days. So this all brings in this concept of social morphogenesis. It's one of the reasons I called this the transformation age, going back to 2012, because I saw what the smartphones were going to do when they were released in 2008 with high-speed data networks and the way that they were shaping our minds in different ways and the implications that had on power structures. So social morphogenesis comes out of the critical realist tradition. It's one of the major integrative meta-theoretical models that we work with here at the Institute. There's a lot to talk about there. Um, and one of the things that's at stake here and directly implicated is this notion of worldviews, which I'm sure we'll talk about a lot today, because different worldviews are operating and competing for their values, are competing for their reproduction. Worldviews generate identity for people, and then those identities reproduce those worldviews. And to some extent, you can think about them as self-reproducing ecosystems in that way. And Brendan is doing great work on worldviews and validating the rise of what we think is a new worldview, the integrative worldview, which we'll talk about. But the point is that there are these worldviews that are kind of competing for the future, if you will, and that issues of identity, issues of power, issues of where does this social morphogenesis take us are all directly implicated by the question of worldviews. So these are all the sort of global backdrop that we find ourselves in. It's a fascinating time to be alive. As the Chinese say, it's an interesting time to be alive. Not always a comfortable time. It's requiring new adaptive skills. It's requiring new ways of sense making. It's requiring new ways of leading. But all of this is at stake with what we're doing. And of course, symptomatically, it yields a metacrisis. And we'll talk about that as well. Nick has done some seminal work in the field on the metacrisis as basically a symptom of our underlying dominant worldview. So, with that as our backdrop for sort of the world we live in, the way we think about sort of some of our biggest global contexts, why the Institute came into being, and why we wanted to create an academic journal, which allows us to ask big questions of these kinds of contexts, ask big important questions from our biggest picture systems of philosophy and thinking from these integrative meta theories, which is really the inspiration behind creating the academic journal and the society. So with that, that's sort of my little tee up on this. I'll invite both of my compatriots to really expound on all of these themes and kind of where we go from here.
Yeah, that's a great framing, Rob. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, so just to kind of underscore a couple of things you brought up, it's kind of the structuring kind of pillars, if that's the right way of talking about it, in terms of what the Institute sort of stands on in terms of a context of metacrisis, a an appreciation for worldview as being really a core driving generative mechanism of the symptomology that we see as being sort of representative of the metacrisis, and the role that integrative metatheory can play, not just in terms of elucidating and making tractable the metacrisis, but also as a context in which worldview philosophy itself, in a sense, gets shaped. And then not just doing that in a kind of hollow, sterile, abstract, theoretical space for its own purposes, but actually to try to utilize the insights, operationalize the findings from the research that we do and from the advancement of these meta theories and this meta theoretical philosophizing to the issues that are contained in that metacrisis framing itself. So trying to acknowledge those different aspects, I think that that's a really nice way to kind of tell the story of what we're about, what I am is doing, in terms of the various aspects of the work going into the different kind of bins or pillars of these efforts. So yeah, I guess I would just name those as kind of a nice way to situate I am relative to all of that, and then maybe we can talk about those in greater detail and dig those up a little bit. But any other thoughts you might have, Nick, to set us up for any of this?
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, yeah, and there's so much more we could say about the context and of this moment on the planet and the meta crisis. And without going into that in any kind of comprehensive way, I would just name that I also feel really present to the ecological crisis as such an important backdrop. It doesn't grab headlines in quite the same way as the sort of socio-political events do, but it continues to unfold in a powerful way. Just in the last few weeks here on the West Coast, we just got hammered by all these atmospheric rivers, and there was flooding. And I was up in Oregon visiting my family, and I went to go hiking at my favorite place to hike, the Columbia River Gorge, in a place called Eagle Creek. We got up there, and the trail was completely gone because there had been huge landslides there. The creek had flooded and overtaken the whole road and the whole campground, and there were giant, multi-ton logs blocking the road. And we're like, okay, I guess we're not going hiking here. But that just as a kind of micro instantiation of the times that we're facing. The 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries in the planetary boundaries framework that has come out of the Stockholm Resilience Center and Johan Rockström's work have been crossed. One of those is climate change. And if you just look at climate change itself, that has just radically profound ripple effects. There was also a paper that was published in Nature that talked about how we're approaching these thresholds in the Earth system, these tipping points from the polar ice caps to the Amazon rainforest to the ocean conveyor belts that transfer heat across the planet. And the notion is that we're approaching many of these thresholds. The coral reefs actually this year they've determined that we actually have crossed those tipping points with regards to coral reefs, and we're at a collapse point with regards to the coral reefs. Now, these tipping points also could potentially cascade, and this is what this Nature article was talking about. One tipping point could cascade to tip the others. So we're in the midst of a really radical transformation on the Earth, in the Earth system, that obviously has huge implications for the ways our societies run, our economies, et cetera. So I just wanted to presence that piece in addition to what you said, Rob.
Yeah, and to actually tie those together, which again is sort of the whole point of the metacrisis framing, is to appreciate these as being interwoven and interlocking, interpenetrating crises, right? Like arguably, the capture of Maduro and the geopolitical tensions relative to Venezuela are entirely to be framed within the context of the fossil fuel industry, the need for oil, and an interesting way in which that geopolitical tension is unfolding because of our existing sort of energy constraints and the system that has been sort of, how would you say, sort of shored up and kind of given new life in a way with the Trump administration and this sort of right-wing sort of reflex, whereas before there'd been this sort of long arc towards renewable energy and this sort of, kind of impotent but still well-meaning kind of environmental policy that was being advanced by the kind of neoliberal order to some degree, however feckless. Now it's just sort of, gone the other way entirely. It's, drill, baby, drill. It's oil, it's coal. It's like looking back in many ways in the same way that our geopolitical strategy is now looking back to the 19th century. There's just been this massive reflex back. And all of that arguably is directly related as well to sort of the epistemic crisis and how people are looking at who are the leaders that they feel are appropriate to lead, and what do we want from the people in power? How do we trust people? How do we believe what people say, or do we not care anymore? Or what sort of media is out there in communications operations and propaganda that can take advantage of people's skills or lack thereof in terms of making these kinds of sense-making adjudications? So there's just this tapestry, this network of things that once you identify a problem over here, you're realizing, oh, this is downstream of this over here, and this is downstream of this over here. And maybe they're all kind of downstream of each other in a way that they're all kind of convergently feeding into each other. That, I think, is like a really good representation of the sort of networked crisis of the metacrisis that we're facing.
Absolutely, yeah. So that the ways in which all these crises are, they're in these relationships of feedback, they're compounding on each other. They're profoundly interrelated. You tug on one thread and it pulls on all the others. This is the sort of polycrisis insight. Um, and if you look at, the polycrisis, and you try and develop kind of interventions that say, okay, how do we transform the geopolitical landscape in America or whatnot? And you don't look at, all the other elements, like it's it's not going to be successful. Like those interventions absolutely won't be successful unless you have a truly meta-systematic approach that can penetrate to a deeper ontological level, the level of worldview. And that's really the heart of the meta crisis. And that's also, there's a really important relationship there to meta theorizing, right? So in our kind of understand, Robb did a wonderful white paper on a sociology of big pictures. Randall Collins wrote an amazing book called The Sociology of Philosophies. And in those resources, they articulate this process by which a handful of big picture philosophers that come together in these small groups and engage deeply and develop these kind of micro and meso level movements that are essentially framing a big picture understanding of reality, a kind of a micro worldview, that eventually some of those sort of catch the winds of the zeitgeist and they start to ripple out and they start to influence the broader culture and sociopolitics till they eventually become mainstream. So the argument that we make at the Institute, and I've made in my thesis, is that underneath or down, upstream of worldviews is actually meta theory. And by meta theorizing well, we just might actually have an impact on the level of worldview that can eventually trickle down to the level of socioeconomic and political systems and technological systems. And that's the kind of crucial leverage point for getting into a transformative process.
I do think, picking up on a theme you said, Brendan, that there is a way in which we are, whether we like it or not, we're all kind of on the train in this radical revanchist sort of maneuver worldwide. Like we're all going back in this revanchist sort of back to the 19th century or even earlier in all four of the integral theories quadrants. Like we're being pulled back there in terms of our mythic structures and our, what we're being asked to believe is true spiritually. And we're being asked to go way back in terms of what we're supposed to believe politically, almost pre-liberal, pre-constitutional. We're being asked to engage in or believe in kind of a Schmittian or almost Machiavellian geopolitical realism that certainly has moments of truth. Power matters. But there's a reason why the Treaty of Westphalia, took hold and ultimately over the course of hundreds of years in trying to decrease the incidence of war, humans decided that was not a very good idea to just situate geopolitics in a realism. And so we're being asked to go back to that as if those lessons were never learned. We're asked to move our identities back, from what could be thought of even over the last 20 or 30 years as all of us having some component of identity as a global citizen, as a plural identity of having different interests and different ways in which we can identify with our composite being as multifaceted and plural and associating with different cultures and value systems. I think in a way that's very healthy and we all probably really love, to being asked to sort of take all of that and move it back to something that's far more ethnocentric, far more bounded by boundaries and borders and nationalisms, and that never worked either very well. Like one of the things about all of these requests to go back is that throughout history we killed each other a lot. Like when we had to engage in those sort of really hard boundaries, and so there's no doubt that the current system is arising for a reason that has to do with a certain brokenness in it, and it needs healing for sure. But by no means are things perfect. but where we're being asked to go in response to that, the cure is going to be far worse than the disease, and that's, I think, why people are as sort of scared as they are. So I just wanted to sort of reflect back. I think it's a really good way to think about how much we're being asked to sort of move back. I think ultimately it's not going to work. I think people don't want to do that. But then the question is, and this really brings us to the heart of our work, well, that's what the algorithms are telling me is my only choice. Like, all I'm getting served is narrow perspectives and narrow ideologies and, buy my six-pack video on Instagram and, like all of this stuff, right? So the point is that there's this massive epistemic fragmentation. What is a new story that can arise to actually bring some coherence and integration to all of that noise and all of that fragmentation? What is that new story that actually gives us an identity we can believe in, that's credible, that is scientifically legitimated, that actually is philosophically wise, that is loving and taps into our best intuitions about who we are or want to be? And this is where the new story of wholeness, I think, comes in. So, Brendan, I guess I'd invite you to talk a little bit about the role of story
Mm.
and the way worldviews generate stories that tell us who we are, and in return, we identify with them, and then we animate the worldview, we animate those value structures.
Yeah, there's a lot one could say about that. I mean, that in itself is kind of captures kind of the core of it, that worldviews are, while they have certainly a propositional kind of content to them, of varying degrees of sort of explicitness, the way that story and narrative works to kind of fashion that set of presuppositions into a kind of coherent lens through which people then interpret the world is I think that's one of the kind of recurring aspects of worldview theory that, as I've been diving into the literature and doing sort of a systematic literature review on this topic of worldview, and doing kind of primary research, I guess you could say, through interviews, and examining kind of the structures of meaning making that people employ. I think that narrative framing is absolutely key. And how one answers these fundamental questions, these big questions, or BQs, as the worldview scholars refer to them, is really what provides sort of the narrative context. It like sets the stage for, well, in a sense, the values that then fall out of that, and then the behaviors and the actions that people take to achieve those goals and those values. So in kind of the worldview frame, and Nick and I are working on a paper on this that we hope to have ready early in 2026. There are these major questions like, what is the case? What is reality, right? Kind of like basic ontology. How do you know, right? Epistemology. And then from that, you have a sort of picture where under the kind of ontological what is categories, you want to know, okay, well, where did things come from? Where are they going? So sort of cosmology, teleology as sort of subcategories of what is or ontology. And that basically is a narrative, right? Where did we come from? What's going on right now? And where are we going? And then kind of what does fall out of that is an implicit set of values, right? Like relative to where we are going or where we should be going, what then do we do now to achieve that, or work to those ends? And so the whole set of value structures and a whole set of then practical actions that people take to achieve them is basically the outcome of a worldview frame that's structured in that way. So in terms of framing that in narrative form, you can imagine how, to use, just one example, how people might make sense of the world in such a way where if they're employing, say, a mythological frame that puts them in the world that's soon to implode and fall apart with an apocalypse, and maybe everything is just here for people's sort of resources to, dominate, and they were given by maybe like a higher power, and it's just sort of like, everything's really actually beyond that really matters, and here is just going to burn, imminently. That's going to have impacts for how you show up in the world. It's going to impact the way that you look at nature and relate to nature, the way that you think of stewardship, and the kind of long-term goals of the viability and sustainability of this planet as it is and your role in it. Right. So a very different narrative is one that kind of takes a much longer view, for example, and you can multiply these in all sorts of ways, but in evolutionary narratives that sees humanity as sort of the outgrowth of a long evolutionary process in which we are of the earth, and the earth that in a sense has sort of come to realization of itself, and we are participating in that process, and that our place here has kind of inherent significance to us. That's a very different narrative, right? And so then you can imagine how that's going to impact behaviors. Nick and his colleagues in the past have done empirical work that have looked at these questions in terms of how people act relative to issues of climate change and energy consumption and these sorts of things relative to the worldview that they ascribe to. And so if we take all of that very seriously, if we take very seriously that the worldview frames and shapes behavior, and that the narratives that we are working with are, kind of the kernel of that, then the stories we tell have this incredible importance for our own self-understanding, the way that we view the world and therefore construct the world, and therefore the way that we kind of build the world. And so that, I think, is really core to the, in a sense, the theory of change that we're working with, is that if we are in line with reality, if there's a alethic resonance there in kind of the terms that Nick emphasizes with his visionary realism, then a story that brings people closer into alignment with what is going to have real consequences for that viability, for that sustainability, and for that collective human flourishing. So anyway, I could clearly go on and on and on about this, but I think that that's a really key point for sure.
Yeah, no, I love that. I appreciate that answer very much. The idea that worldviews, identity, and story are three sides of the same coin in a way. And Nick, you've talked about the role of identity and the fracture of identity as a driver for the meta crisis. Maybe you could say, pick up on this theme of the worldview leading to identity and how it's shaping our identities, which is then directly driving that metacritical set of outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, worldviews are, to me, they're not, abstractions, and they're not just ways of sort of reflecting the world in some kind of correlationist sense of it. In the way I'm thinking about it, in visionary realism, worldviews and the whole realm of interiority is part of the real. And so there are real causal forces on the level of interiority that are just as real as, the real causal forces on the exterior level of like gravity and the laws that we can infer from that. So I think of worldviews as kind of like these generative mechanisms, these causal forces, right? And on the most basic level, it's a causal force that's in part kind of constellating an identity, and those identities are felt. Um, it's not just an abstract intellectual identity. It's also a deeply somatic and emotional and psychological kind of embodiment that it confers, right? And so there's a feedback loop there between the worldview and the identity and how we're acting in the world. And I really love, Mark Edwards' point that, in a sense, everyone has an implicit metatheory. So we could think of metatheory as the sort of formalized philosophical, intellectual inquiry, the reflexive inquiry into what is my worldview. And so metatheorizing is just sort of bringing to more consciousness and self-awareness, what is that identity, the deep assumptions and presuppositions that I'm holding about who I am, what is my relationship, how do I conceive of a sense of the divine or the sacred, or what is ultimately meaningful in this life? What is nature, and how do I relate to the natural world? And is it conceived of as something that is kind of an object for my exploitation, or perhaps it's conceived of as, we are nature. We might happen to have some emergent powers of mind and logos and whatnot as human beings, but it also could be conceived of in that way, as that there's a radical continuity between who I am and what I conceive of as nature. The sort of cosmogony of like where did this all come from? So everyone has an answer to these questions. They might not be very well articulated or reflected on, but it's really hard to move through the world without some kind of at least proto basic implicit answer to these questions. So yeah, I think it's a powerful insight to realize that, hey, this stuff about meta theory and worldviews isn't just stuff that these nerdy philosophical guys with PhDs are talking about. It's like this is the kind of basic backdrop of all of our lives. And so to bring this to more consciousness, I think it confers the possibility of doing it better. So it's this insight that meta theorizing is inescapable. It's inexorable. So we can't really get away from it, but we can do it more or less well. There can be more or less wisdom and awareness and consciousness that's brought to that process, and understanding the forces that are shaping our own identities, other people's identities, which are then, as we've been saying, upstream of the systems, the social systems and technological systems that really shape our world.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And my invitation to people that would be listening would be one way to make this very practical in a way almost is like every time you see somebody, do a post on X or do a social media post or some leader say something or watch some leader do something, ask yourself, what worldview are they, does it look like they're coming from and sort of implicitly in terms of how they think about reality? What are they valuing? How are they behaving? What is their identity that's associated with that? And what are they reproducing? They're probably reproducing the worldview through their behavior. They're probably reproducing the worldview through how they're spending their money or, what they're doing in the world or how they're communicating. People often talk about like a bright future and transformation and this, but they don't kind of like there's this magic happening in the middle that they haven't theorized. Well, that's the theory right there. What you do is what reproduces the systems that either generate a tomorrow that looks like today or creates novelty that becomes something different.
Hmm.
And it is certainly within our right to ask of our leaders and to ask of ourselves watching our leaders, what are they reproducing? What are they reproducing, and how is that generating a worldview that's either in service to us and our real life conditions today, or is increasingly out of date or needs to be updated?
Yeah.
This is a praxis that I think we could all engage in.
Well, and also, I mean, while there is the aspect of sort of worldview reproduction and system reproduction going on, some worldviews in certain systems might be sort of self-terminating, right? They actually might not be geared towards long-term sustainable success. Arguably, right now, with the level of power and I mean, whether that's nuclear force or the capacity to unleash the world's armies on each other, or to do any number of things, the scale that modernity has brought into being as a real possibility. What worldview unfolds at that scale has existential import for the globe. And so if we're now going back to this 19th century great powers politics and kind of all of our sense of identities being shifted back and all of that, if actually we are radically progressing in terms of technological capacity, in terms of ramping up, all the kind of systemic capacities in that sense, and yet we're regressing in terms of our ability to make coherent sense of ourselves in a kind of broad, big picture way and relate to others in a kind of holistic and, kind of planetary citizen sort of way, then you can imagine this incredible mismatch, right? I mean, right, there's that quote. I think it was actually, I think it was E.O. Wilson who said something like the great problem that we face is that we have, godlike technology and sort of like modern systems and Paleolithic emotions. Paraphrasing, but that is
Yeah,
really like the
yeah.
challenge before us. And so if our worldviews aren't up to snuff in terms of what we are working with in terms of the system, then there is a kind of profound mismatch there that has, yeah, serious existential import in a way that it might be a immediately self-reproducing system, but it might be very temporally bound in terms of how long that can actually happen. So we need to be asking questions of like, what does a long-term sustainable self-reproducing worldview and system look like, and how do those pairings match? What's the logic behind all of this? Everything that we're talking about in terms of a kind of natural progression or unfolding of sense of identity and scope and compassion and care and all of these things relative to increasing systemic power, that's all informed metatheoretically, right? That is actually in order to understand what's going on in the world geopolitically and the values that people are working from and what actions they're taking. You look out, in some ways, you find that incredibly bewildering if you don't have some of these maps. But whether or not you can use them to understand exactly, why this happened or this happened, the point is that they provide a frame in which what is unfolding otherwise lacks a kind of orientation of like, is this the right way to be going? Well, maybe this is just the way things should unfold. Like maybe now is the time when we go back to this way of doing, right? So if you don't have a map to make sense of sort of some of the axis along which we might expect or even predict some of these things to unfold, then you're kind of just, you're kind of sailing blind into this whole space where worldview is so important. So using some of these meta-theoretical models to kind of frame these questions offers this kind of new vision. And I think that we want to be able to advance that and be on the leading edge of the capacities of those, theories to do that, but also see them more broadly implemented, right? Why aren't these issues being framed more, let's say, in terms of the policymakers and the people in power? Are they using this level of analysis when they're assessing certain geopolitical issues? Are media companies even using these kinds of approaches or not? Because if all of these systems are kind of getting themselves stuck in self-terminating cycles, obviously that's not really in anyone's interest. And so I think being able to, again, not just advance these meta-theoretical models, but to see their implementation and utilization, that increase, I think that puts us in a better situation sort of, collectively going forward.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that theme, and then in a moment here we'll turn to the journal itself and the society and the work we're going to be doing from a research point of view in that. But finishing up some of the context, um, I think what you just said is true. But of course, I can also hear people saying, yeah, but of course those particular organizations, those particular power holders or whatever, are is definitely in their interest, at least as far as they can judge it. And that's precisely the problem, right? Is that these organizations or what have you have a certain amount of power in the world where they are quite happy to play out their system, exercise that power for short-term and relatively narrowly bounded benefit for them or a group of stakeholders. And in one sense, it's rational that they do that. It's a bounded system that Herbert Simon won a Nobel Prize on, that bounded rationality. Like we get that. But as Brendan just said, like the problem is it's also radically short-sighted in the long term. So we have a huge coordination problem ultimately. Like all of us human primates will do things that have a certain amount of short-term thinking and immediate benefit. But how do we coordinate as things get more and more complex? And this is why a lot of what I think our message at the Institute and a lot of the initiatives we're thinking about aren't just for the leaders, which, the a little bit more of the elders who are inside of these systems. We're also thinking about the young people. We're thinking about the next generation of leaders because I think that those folks, if they're listening right now and they're, in late teens or early 20s, like they get it. They're being raised amidst this chaos and they're looking at the adults going, where's the wisdom in the room? Like who are the adults that are running things? Because they seem really confused, and of course they are. Um, but our message here is that like with all of the things competing for your attention, this is something you can actually responsibly bet your future on. This kind of broader way of thinking will protect you from being trapped in narrow ideologies that constrain who you are and who you can become. And it'll help you sort of grow without shrinking the world or yourself. So I think from a point of view of the protection it affords for a lifelong development of who you really can become, it becomes very powerful. And I would say that ties into our belief that ultimately evolution, it proceeds sometimes one funeral at a time, but it's going to also proceed by the younger generations listening and watching all of the chaos and saying, I need to tune into frameworks of meaning and frameworks of sense making I can trust to kind of hold my freedom and fullness over the course of decades. And where is that? And I would very much invite them to take this seriously as perhaps one of the only candidates in the world that could do that. And so I guess with that as my pitch for to the Zoomers.
Well, can I
I
pick up
would,
something real quick on there just
yeah,
before
please, yeah.
I just want to throw in too, because I think it's a great setup to this issue, which is that, in terms of getting involved in emancipatory and liberatory kind of struggles, essentially, which I think also that like millennials and Zoomers really are sensitive to. They see how broken the world is. They want to be out there. They want to be active. They want to change the system. And I think, though, sort of what the default assumption is that if you, I guess, want to do that kind of work, then the models you use and the theory you use, harkens back to the old kind of postmodernists and the kind of certain set of kind of critical theorists from the late 20th century. And I would really invite people to see what we're talking about in critical emancipatory terms, right? If we're talking about systems in place because people have short-term incentives and power holders who are basically using their power to keep something going for them that ultimately hurts the bulk of people while maintaining their status, trying to disrupt those kinds of systems is, I think, what genuine emancipatory projects are about, to try to actually make a more widely distributed sense of human flourishing real, and not just sort of keep perpetuating really broken and destructive systems for the sake of a few. I think, again, like that, the constituency, the demographics that you're describing there, Rob, they get that really, really intensely. Ironically, though, a lot of the theory and the middle level theory that gets used to try to do that is the same sort of postmodern thought that's led to some of these crises being perpetuated over and over again. I mean, if we look at what's going on in terms of this kind of strange postmodern president and his regression to a 19th century power politics, it's utilizing the kind of moral relativism, strange kind of, alternative sense making about making up facts, and in terms of just history is what you say. You can kind of change it and use, truth is just a power game. All these sorts of things are now in the hands of these kinds of postmodern tools are in the hands of the people who are setting up and reproducing these destructive narrow systems. And if you don't have a big picture understanding of those dynamics, then you're not going to be able to resolve them, right? Arguably, a lot of people in history who tried to do emancipatory projects wound up causing also a lot of harm. If you look at a lot of the lessons of the 20th century and the totalitarian regimes that used certain ways of thinking that also just weren't up to snuff. They weren't broad enough. They didn't conceive of matters systemically enough and in all of their complexity. And we can do a lot of harm in our attempt to engage in these kinds of emancipatory struggles if we don't have a big enough perspective and enough kind of a complexity in the mix. So I think for those groups of people that you're naming going forward, and for anyone watching this to understand, I think the importance of what it is that we're doing, I think it's key to see all of this meta-theoretical work and the care to attend to the plurality of worldviews and how they inform people's action. All of this stuff we've been talking about, I think, is in service to a kind of emancipatory project for broad planetary human flourishing. And I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, that's great. Love it. Nick, any other comments before we move into the journal itself and some of the research vectors and the themes?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think what you're saying there, both you guys are adding there, is really valuable. And I think it's important to like pull back and see the kind of grand geohistorical trajectory that we're on here. And the movement from in modernity, there was kind of a naive realism and a kind of positivist orientation. And then we move into this post-60s, postmodern critique of modernity, and a social constructivism and a radical relativism. And, kind of both those points of view really are so profoundly limited, right? And I think we're in the early stages of beginning to come into a kind of this grand dialectical synthesis moment where we can acknowledge, hey, look, there is a reality out there. I think it was Philip K. Dick who said, "A reality is that which, when we stop believing in it, continues to exist," right? And I believe it was Pierce who said that reality is that which resists misinterpretation, right? So there's like something there. There is this renewed appreciation that there is a reality out there that's not just being constructed through power games and language games, and yet the postmodernists had a lot to offer that was right. A lot of that can be resolved in the notion that look, the sociosphere in large part is a social construction, but that construction can be more or less in resonance and in alignment with reality or not. And so this broad meta principle of alethic resonance that our worldviews, our ideas, our social institutions, our technologies can be more or less in resonance or in dissonance with the broader field of reality in the biosphere and the physiosphere and whatnot. And so I think it's really a powerful understanding that, look, we can honor that there's an aspect of reality that is a construct, and we do have these radical powers of logos and self-reflexive mind and concept-dependent agency that we can deploy, and that is a kind of construct. But that's happening within a much larger context of the world that created us. So the world that we create is happening within the context of the world that created us, and those two things need to actually be in resonance if we're going to flourish. And if we're out of resonance in terms of our social forms or our thoughts, our worldviews, then we will see the real effects of that. Like that's not just an abstract thing. Goethe has a beautiful quote. He says, "When nature expresses abhorrence, she does so out loud. The creature that lives falsely is destroyed early." So this is kind of the essence of why is it a self-terminating system? Because it's out of resonance with reality. There's that
Yeah.
kind of implicit hubris and lack of attunement and listening, and that also could be construed as a misattuned relationship. Like we're not in right relationship with the broader world, which we can think of as nature or the sacred or reality as such. And so if you don't move with reality, reality will move you. If you don't, the indigenous worldview says if you don't move with the land will move you, right? And so this appreciation that like um, we're kind of in this in a bind situation where it's like there is no escape from reality. You either come into resonance or you get terminated, and that's kind of simplistic. And there's a lot of gray areas in between, and we're in those spaces right now. But I think and maybe this is a bit of a segue to talking about the journal. Is like reality is this vast gestalt that transcends disciplinary boundaries, right? Reality is itself transdisciplinary and complex and holistic and nuanced. And so in our knowledge production processes and the way we construe the world and the way that we metatheorize and begin to construct our worldview, we want to honor as much of that complexity as we can. We want to scan across the whole horizon of all the disciplines and then see how do we coherently interweave them into a holistic, integrative understanding of how it all fits together, and then do our best to live in resonance with that. And it's an ongoing processual unfoldment. Like there is no static endpoint. It's learning to be in a really refined dance as a human collective, right? So I think that's tees up a little bit of what we're trying to do with the journal integration. We're trying to integrate on many levels science, philosophy across the special science, the disciplines of the special sciences to basically create a big picture understanding that is as in resonance as possible with reality. And then as we become more and more resonant with reality, I argue that we can actually become an expression of that reality. We're not just standing back in our white lab coats and mirroring reality in an objective way. We are actually we're describing reality objectively, and then we can start to participate in that reality and kind of reweave that circle. The human being actually becomes this expression of reality in a new way. So I think the journal is trying to invite scholarship that is moving back towards that sophisticated holism that transcends and includes the key insights that we've gleaned in modernity and postmodernity, and can move forward with them and translate them into actionable initiatives and insights.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something related to that and the way that this kind of folding back in works. Rob had brought up stories and narratives earlier, and one of the things that was on my mind was this, which is that one of the things that's been really becoming very clear to me more and more is how the meta-theoretical attempt to do what you're describing and integrate these disciplines and these different ways of knowing and the fields of science and the humanities, et cetera, that itself is, you could say, that becomes clear when you have the story, right? Because one of the chief sort of lenses that we use in the Institute and that the journal will also be sort of highlighting are these evolutionary, processual, relational, and complexifying maps of, you can call it big history, you can call it cosmic evolution, but it's because we live in an evolutionary world that's been unfolding over billions of years that produces emergent phenomena through this evolutionary complexification, that we get biology out of physics, that we get psychology out of biology, that we get culture and sociology and all the human sciences, out of psychology and so on. But it's that story that makes that meta-theoretical integrative effort coherent. And then you actually see that having, in a sense, that story clarifies how to put the pieces of reality together in terms of our knowledge of reality. And when that started coming clear to me, it wasn't just anymore, oh, this is a great new story. It was like, oh, this is a story that renders coherent and transparent how all of the different ways of knowing reality and its various kinds of complexity, how those hang together in an integrative sort of way. And so the work we're doing with this journal, and that we want the scholars contributing it to be advancing, right? I mean, that work is part and parcel with telling a new story as well. And these kind of things, they go hand in hand.
I think that's a great tee up to a really important thing that many listeners will know, but some might not, which is, why did we end up in sort of a radically siloed knowledge system today, 2025? Our knowledge production systems are really, really siloed, really deep, but really narrow. Um, and just really briefly, and of course the guys can expound on this too, is like, go back to the first philosophers with the Greeks, the pre-Socratics. There was a fusion between big picture philosophizing and, frankly, what we would now consider science. Like, okay, what's going on here with reality? And I have this sort of theory of science of what's happening. Thales thought the world was composed of water, that was the original arche, was water. And so that was almost like a scientific theory, but it was also a big picture theory. A couple thousand years go by, and there's this sort of continual fusion between this big picture philosophy, like what's going on with how we live and what's worth, what's beautiful, what's good, what's true. And we don't yet have this version of science, but along comes the modern era, 500, 400 years ago, and all of a sudden, as philosophy starts to distinguish into epistemology and metaphysics, and there becomes an attack on traditional metaphysics, and then you get the rise of much more modern sciences, sociology and anthropology and history and economics and all these things in the 19th century and beyond. Well, then you get this radical differentiation into all of these silos of knowledge. Of course, we have the modern university system. We've got governments that it's their interest to fund R&D and all this stuff. The point is that I'm really picking up on the theme you just talked about, Brendan, which is it's not only a big history, sort of evolutionary arc of physics and chemistry and biology, which is how the universe emerged from the point of view of the natural sciences. It's also how did the human beings of the last few thousand years come to understand those differentiations. And what we are sitting here in 2025 is we've kind of forgotten how to do big picture philosophizing. Like, and now we're super, super good at asking the most tiniest, narrow questions ever, really deep in some tiny discipline. But you can forget that person who just did their PhD on some tiny atomic thing over there in like the microeconomics of green, bean growing in an Oregon field with like how that's related to some other thing in terms of values and spiritual things over here. Like and there's no allowance for big picture philosophizing. So one of the things I'd like people to sort of invite into their view is the idea that we are living in a fractured knowledge economy. And we're living in a fractured knowledge economy because we've not been able to do really big picture philosophizing for a long time. And our funding systems, our education systems, and our research systems are set up to have a radically narrow knowledge that's not fundamentally integrative. And this is another part of what we at the Institute and many others of our colleagues are really pointing out. Jürgen Wren does a great job of this. We need a new knowledge economy of integration to come into being, and it's going to take a few decades to kind of reintegrate to achieve this. But it's absolutely critical because if we don't, we will continue to sort of languish in these silos where we never get a bigger, more alethic picture of reality that's actually operable.
Yeah, that's great, Rob. I think, there are actually rational relationships between the different disciplines that are, a big part of what these meta-theoretical frameworks are trying to discern. And for example, I mean, philosophy and science, the idea of science as being a very sort of siloed pursuit over here, and then there's the humanities and philosophy over here. This is arguably a kind of an anachronistic notion, or it's not an entirely rational construal of the relationship of those fields. And in fact, philosophy, we used to think of science as natural philosophy, and I know Greg Heinrichs is trying to re-vindicate that notion in a sense, and I think that's a really important thing to do. Is like, in a sense, yes, science is important, and it in many ways could be understood as just a philosophy focused on, kind of understanding the objective causal forces and laws that are animating the natural world, right? So Roy Bhaskar, Jean Piaget, they both have these kind of meta theories of the relationship, and Wilber also has these meta theories that disclose the systematic interrelationships between the various disciplines and the associated methods that those disciplines deploy. And for Bhaskar, philosophy kind of necessarily has to set the foundation for any scientific inquiry. So you can just take a purely scientific, experimental, scientific inquiry, and Bhaskar, uses transcendental arguments and retroductions to show, well, what are the conditions for the possibility, the necessary, rationally necessary conditions for the possibility of even having your most rudimentary physical scientific experiment. And he shows that you actually need a whole ontology that can only be got at through philosophy. It's a philosophical ontology. There's nothing empirical about it, but you actually have to construe the world in a way that's, stratified, changing, differentiated, etc., where ontology can't be collapsed with epistemology. The world can't be collapsed with human knowing about the world, or there would be no intelligibility to doing an experiment. And then also, and that, the forces that are allowing objects to move in a law-like way, that these are actually transfactual forces that can't be collapsed to, um, constant conjunctions of events, right? So there's something that's deeper there. And these are all philosophical things that can be transcendentally retroduced from just looking at a physics experiment. So all that is to say, the idea that there is a science that is independent from philosophy is just kind of a modernist delusion and fallacy, right?
Yeah, it doesn't work at all.
Yeah, and so a good scientist knows that you need a good philosophy of science, and a really good scientist knows I'm actually kind of a natural philosopher, and so I should be proficient in ontology and epistemology and axiology and so on. And so Roy says that there's a syncategorigmatic relationship between philosophy and science. In other words, these are categories that necessarily must go arise together. You can look at it the other way too, that philosophy needs science to give it that empirical richness. There's only very abstract and general statements are kind of possible on that level of pure philosophy of science, right? So to understand the empirical richness of the world and the substantive, concrete textures of the world, we need science as well. So you can start to see that there's, Piaget has the idea of the circle of the sciences, right? That when they're working together well, they're kind of feeding back into each other. And so if we might find something in the sciences that's inconsistent with our philosophical foundations, and then there's a demand there that's placed that the philosophy must evolve in light of those scientific findings, so that our philosophical understanding and our scientific understanding are together profoundly interrelated in a big picture, in a meta-theoretical frame. And I think that's really important. And back to your point, Rob, that all these disciplines are so fragmented. I mean, this was the differentiations of modernity that Habermas and Wilbur talk about, that then slid into dissociation. And we forgot that science is actually natural philosophy, and that these things are all interrelated and grounded in a world. It's actually kind of basic, but it's actually not rational to construe these things as radically siloed. So this is part of what Habermas is pointing to when he talks about the unfinished project of modernity, or
Yeah.
enlightenment, the unfinished project of enlightenment, right? So we actually need to keep following that golden thread of reason to reweave our understanding of how all these disciplines relate in an integrated understanding, and that in doing so, that's like how we start to heal those dissociations of the value spheres and weave them back together into a coherent understanding that then can be the basis of taking action towards a flourishing world.
With that, let's dive into the journal and its some of its research themes and vectors, and why all this is totally rich territory for why we want to be able to peer out into the world and ask, of any big context, of any big problem, of any big issue, we want to take these big pictures and ask big questions. So that's really the goal between the Integration Society and the journals. We wanted to institutionalize the vehicle that normalizes everything we've spent the last 45 minutes talking about. It normalizes this as a backdrop of the kind of inquiry we want to do.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, just the first sentence of the aims and scope of the journal reads, "We welcome work that theorizes across disciplines, operationalizes big picture models that integrate philosophy and special sciences and translates such syntheses into real world practice." And so that's a lot, kind of condenses what we've been getting at. And I mean, yeah, obviously people should check out the website of the journal to get kind of the full description, integrationjournal.org, that kind of gives the full aim and scope there. But I think the sort of thematic vectors that we're inviting submissions on also kind of encapsulates this really well. I won't necessarily list them all, but number one, fittingly, is developing frameworks for analysis and integration of knowledge, which is sort of the overall kind of goal here. But number two is work that explores evolution across scales, and looking for patterns that hold across these different emergent planes of complexity, to provide some of the insight about deeper structures that hold in these different kind of emergent planes. Complexity and systems approaches, kind of similarly. Number four is transformations in worldview. And this kind of gets to what Rob was talking about a second ago, which I thought was really great, because as I was saying earlier, it's not just that the story is the narrative unfolding that provides the context of understanding the different ontological sort of realities that our different disciplinary approaches are trying to understand. It's also that the the transformations in worldviews over human history themselves map the way that humans have understood how the world works differently across time. And so we need to make that object as well. A lot of what we've been talking about and what Nick's been getting at, especially, is like this transformation from kind of modern positivism and a certain kind of reductionistic rationalism and all that to the critique of postmodernity, and then something beyond that that can recognize the relative insights of each. That's a historical process. So our own epistemologies have been also transformed across time. And to make that object and to study that is really important if we want to sort of reflexively think about not just sort of knowledge integration, but our own knowledge of the way that knowledge gets integrated. So also related, cultural shifts in the 21st century. How is this particularly looking right now? Technology and AI and collective intelligence is directly related to that. And I think also the role that AI is going to play in knowledge integration is a really huge question before us. I know it's something, Rob, that you're really, really interested in and trying to make sure that we are sort of, on that curve and ahead of. But yeah, the way that now, today, as never before, you can talk to a big picture model and ask it to compare itself with another big picture model. You can see what the both the original paper was that was published about that bean farm in Oregon or whatever, and then you can ask it, well, what are the implications for spirituality and this and that, right? And so our very knowledge systems that are emerging right now are uniquely capable to attend to this level of analytical scope. I guess I'll just round out the list because I think they're all relevant here. Science, religion, ultimate concern. I think this one, if you read it, is sort of like, how does this fit on the rest of this list? But I think also, maybe just a way into that is, when Nick was talking, one of the things I wanted to say was that, yes, and everything around the relationship of science and philosophy he was getting at, another element I wanted to throw in there was that, science is not value neutral. The questions you ask are informed by certain values. Doing good science is an axiological issue. The whole supposed breakdown between facts and values is a rather irrational one in many ways. We do certain activities for certain ends, and the activities, the social engagements that we participate in are not just happening in a vacuum and for no reason. So all of our scientific endeavors are framed in broader value contexts, and we should actually be reflexively aware of that and make that object as well. And so science, religion, ultimate concern is sort of like, if we're not attending to those broader aspects as well, we're missing something very, very important. But also beyond that, what can this new integrative approach and the new story and the big picture perspective, how do those bear on how we think about matters of ultimate concern? And of course, how does meaning making and value plug into this evolutionary story? All of that, I think, is sort of encapsulated with that. Responses to the global meta crisis, I think, is pretty obvious. And then finally, practices for integration and applications of big picture frameworks, where we move from meta theory to kind of application and hopefully case studies and suggestions for use or operationalization of some of these things, where the framing of historically really big knotty problems in a way that gets elucidated by some of these maps. That's kind of what we're asking for as a start for submissions to this journal, which hopefully now, and also the context of this conversation, is a bit clearer of how those are kind of holding together as a coherent web.
Yeah, beautiful. And I would just add that, we're also holding this notion of integrative meta theory 2.0, and that a lot of the scholarship that we're trying to do here is coherent with this notion of integrative meta theory 2.0. And the reason why we add the 2.0 there is because big picture theorizing has a rich history. In early modernity, you also had kind of big picture meta theorizing happening, but there was a lot of that was also very much ideological and totalizing and kind of and ended up being a kind of in many cases an apologism for a kind of colonial worldview or whatnot of these grand schemes of moving from primitivism to civilized forms of European modernity and so on. Auguste Comte and whatnot, the early positivists. And so this critique also of kind of these totalizing forms of kind of big picture theorizing. And this is the valid, perspective that a lot of the postmodernists brought. That, hey, we don't want to totalize and have this a kind of an integrative monism, right? Where we're integrating a bunch of different approaches, but into a sort of hegemonic, monistic understanding that ends up being ideological or dogmatic in some more or less explicit way. So this idea of integrative metatheory 2.0 is kind of emerging in the context of metamodernity, moving beyond the postmodern critique into a constructive, a reconstructive kind of approach instead of a strictly deconstructive one that is kind of allergic to the big picture, because that itself is a big picture that's very fragmented and mired in kind of performative contradiction, right? A big picture perspective that denies the reality and value of big pictures. So integrative metatheory 2.0 is saying, hey, we can come back around to understanding the big picture. And in fact, we must come around to understanding the big picture if we're going to flourish as a human society on this planet in the face of the metacrisis, right? So, but this time we're doing it as an integrative pluralism where we really can honor the pluralism, the diversity, and also integrate that. We can find an identity in unity, a unity in diversity in terms of how we're approaching this, that's sensitive to the variety of perspectives and then weaves them together in a non-totalizing way. And this is grounded, this idea of integrative metatheory 2.0 is grounded in four interrelated principles. So the first is methodological transparency and judgmental rationalism. So methodological transparency is the kind of the essence of post-metaphysical thinking, is a kind of procedural rationality and a kind of being clear about what is the methodology that we're using, and that kind of that is a crucial element of that was missing in a lot of the earlier forms of big picture theorizing. Epistemic reflexivity and relativity. This is kind of the postmodern insight that our knowledge is constructed and there's a relativity there, and we need to be sensitive to that and not just totalize that. And we need to situate our own perspective and try and do our best to be self-aware of where are we coming from in terms of our geohistorical positionality and the social and linguistic and cultural and psychological and economic structures that are informing our thinking and our scholarship. And then ontological realism and comprehensiveness is the next one. And we've been talking about that through all this idea that one of the essences of the metamodern or integrative worldview is a kind of return to a realism or a neo-realism, a sophisticated realism that also honors the insights of social constructivism. And then finally, integrative pluralism, which we've been speaking to all along. So, scholarship that's broadly kind of coherent with those sort of principles instantiates this kind of metamodern integrative mode of big picture theorizing. And that's what we're going for. And that's what we feel like is needed in response to the global metacrisis.
Yeah, I'm struck by how much of the conversation that we've had already has shown up in the form of initiatives that we've got underway too. And this is ancillary to the journal, strictly speaking, but I think it's worth pointing out that when we're asking a big question, we're looking at it as a social process. And so it is not just asking a question for the sake of publishing in a journal. It's also really a social process of thinking about it as having a social impact in the world. So what we're trying to do to some degree is anticipate what all of the rational, reasonable questions one might have are, about why you might believe us or not. So, for example, if you said, well, you guys are talking a lot about worldviews. Prove it. Like, why should I believe that? Well, we have an initiative underway, that looks at the Worldview Studies initiative that Brendan is leading, that will probably have work published in the journal at some point, peer reviewed, with real meta studies and meta science underneath that process, which is saying, here's why you should believe an actual, real, emergent, scientifically measurable worldview is actually coming onto the scene. Um, each time we're asking a question like that, we can then put some sort of initiative around it. Nick's doing work in the Metacrisis mapping initiative. Um, we have, you mentioned, Brendan, Greg Enriquez doing something in looking at natural philosophy, sort of a return to natural philosophy as a possibility, and the possibility of that kind of initiative. And so each of these research vectors and each of these themes that are in the journal are important from the point of view of their knowledge components, but they're also important in the way in which they're taking root within the socially inactive processes of a group of very committed people that are forming kind of a commitment for longer term social impact as well. And so that's kind of a neat thing. I think that brings in a little bit of the integration of society, where it's not just a journal, it's actually a society, a group of scholars that are coming together to work collegially together across boundaries, and across disciplines and scopes of concern.
Yeah, which basically, to reiterate a second ago when I was talking about the relationship of knowledge and value, like we do these things for a reason. It's not just, I mean, it's all really fascinating and cool when we want to learn about it, yes. But we also want to put it into practice. We want to not just know the world better in that beautiful, nuanced, holistic complexity that Nick was describing, but we also want to, I think, come into greater alethic resonance with that, which done well produces human flourishing, all right, as we were talking about earlier, and being out of alignment with that, the opposite. So this knowledge formation and clarification is to make the world a better place, which I guess is also always a check for us internally for whatever we're doing. That's always kind of the ultimate, meta criterion of like, is this work making the world better or not? And if it's not fulfilling that, then what are we really up to here? But I think we do all share a belief and a commitment that this is a deeply meaningful and important pursuit, for those reasons. It's again both intellectually, I think, profoundly compelling work to be doing, but it is valuable work and necessary work to be doing. And looking around at the landscape of other think tanks and organizations and intellectual enterprises, there are precious few operating in this kind of a theater. And so in that sense, hopefully this is just the beginning of what will also start to become a broader knowledge economy and a broader knowledge ecosystem of other organizations and other institutions, which is something that the Institute of Applied Metatheory is also aimed at sort of incubating as new kinds of institutions for a new kind of knowledge architecture. But yeah, just to reiterate that we find this work to be important at the end of the day, to the degree that it's able to increase human flourishing, and that's ultimately our lodestar here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I think integration really is doubling down on this notion that, scholarship ought to be in service of human and planetary flourishing. And yeah, I mean, everything you said is totally on point. I mean, Nicholas Maxwell is a great philosopher that he talks about how, knowledge on its own can't really answer the question, what is knowledge for? Like, what ought knowledge serve, right? That's a philosophical wisdom question, right? And so, knowledge or science in itself isn't like a holistically contained rationality. Like it actually needs to defer to philosophy and wisdom traditions in order to become fully rational, right? And so, and then he makes the argument that like there really isn't a good argument for anything other than knowledge being for human flourishing, for human well-being, in service of eudaimonia and the emergence of a eudaimonistic society, or at least a protopian, a slightly better society than what we have. And I think that that sort of perspective is incredibly compelling. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is really, do our best to contribute to that understanding, that that's what scholarship ought to be for.
And one slight addition that I would make to that as well is that one, I think, meaningful difference potentially between integrative metatheory 2.0 and earlier versions was that it's not just human flourishing, it is planetary flourishing, right? If you just use the lens of what's good for, upper class white Europeans, and then you're going to get a certain kind of model that's going to frame your knowledge and your scholarship and all of that and your story. And there's good reason for to critique that, obviously. A different way of approaching that is what's good for the human and the more than human, right? What's good for human flourishing in the long term, which means being in right relationship with the natural element and the animal and the more than human. So it's not just noosphere, it's zoosphere and biosphere and physiosphere collectively to be attuned to, and to try to do big picture thinking that's properly big picture in that sense, and taking all those levels into account, I think is also part of the focus, a core element of that orientation.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a great, perfect segue actually to at least one thing that I wanted to address before we end, and whatever else you guys want to talk about, but which is something that is on a lot of people's mind around AI. And the thing about AI that's absolutely perfect in the context of what you've both just said is that AI is an incredible sort of cognitive augmentation system. It's an incredible knowledge augmentation system. um, you will not, at least at this moment, and maybe for many years to come, yet get AI to have any real sense of intrinsic relevance realization, to use Vervaeke's term, right? For those who are not familiar with it, basically the concept of why. Like, why am I paying attention to something? Why does something get my attention in the environment? Why am I filtering out 99% of the signals in the room right now and focusing in on just this conversation with my colleagues? That why, which is really deeply innate to us as embodied systemic beings in the world, that why can only be answered by us. And every time AI is interacting with us, if you pay attention, you'll see that the why is always being provided by us, never by the AI. The AI can only respond cognitively and knowledge augment, in a knowledge augmentation sense, when we've given it the why, we've given it the context, we've given it the thing we care about, we've given it the topic. Now, this is really, really important, because then the challenge over the next few decades is going to be, as this whole new cognitive exoskeleton for humanity comes into being, human beings are going to have to really think hard and in sophisticated, hopefully, and wise ways about making sure that the whys we're giving AI as it helps us are in fact, we would hope at an integrative level, um, really sensitive to a lot of these kinds of currents, and that the humans designing those systems are doing the same thing, and that we're building in a relevance realization, we're building in a why, a normative direction for these things that actually is really wise. So I'd invite you guys to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I think that that's really key, and it does get back to the importance, continued importance that AI is going to have. I mean, it's a conversation in itself, but briefly, I would just say that there are there are worldview structures currently with a lot of power that might be profoundly misframing these kinds of questions, and might be lacking some of the big picture necessary to adequately address them. And so if, for example, the approach that many are pursuing is one that considers it viable and even ideal for the human to sort of be sloughed off, and the technological sort of, Prometheus to sort of then emerge as the thing that humans ultimately were any good for, but then can kind of be, taken out of the picture. which is a very kind of dominant story and narrative and worldview in Silicon Valley and other places, that there's a profound misframing there that puts value and relevance and meaning making at risk. It also, I think, not just at the level of a kind of assessment or interpretation as being unfortunate. It actually, I think, if you get into the deep structures of how relevance realization works and how AI works and all these sorts of things, you can actually see that just proper technical solutions to these problems won't be found in the way that many people are actually pursuing them. And so, both for technical and for ethical reasons, among others, the right frame, which I think requires a big picture frame of the sort that we've been talking about, is needed for questions of AI and AI ethics and the alignment issue. I mean, just as an example, the notion that the alignment problem is framed potentially as one in which how do we get AIs to do the relevance realization part is fundamentally misframing this arguably, where we are the relevance realization in the way that you're describing. And if you think that the goal is to make a sort of self-sufficient AI absent the kind of human interface, then you've seeded already, you're already invested in a narrative in which the human is redundant rather
Yeah.
than AI being, as you put it, a sort of augmented knowledge system and an exoskeleton in that way. So profoundly different visions for the future of what will be the 21st century because of the importance of AI on the line here, at stake here, depending on what sort of frame you're applying and how you're framing this issue or not relative to big pictures that can actually make that a tractable and ethical decision. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, the whole emergence that's happening in AI right now really brings to the fore the extremely practical, pragmatic relevance of philosophy and big picture thinking, right? Because in all these, the way that these technologies are designed, baked into them is a particular worldview, right? And then these technologies kind of reify that kind of worldview and amplify that signal. And to whatever extent there is an alethic dissonance or resonance there, that's there, the feedback loop gets radically quickened. So I think getting this right in terms of the broad philosophical orientation there is incredibly practical for the future of our society. And so, yeah, I think that's a really important realm of application, and I'm really hoping that we're going to get some really good dialogues and contributions to the journal along these lines.
Yeah, and I want to like circle all the way back to the beginning tee up of the whole conversation we've had, and I said something to the effect that there are worldviews competing for the future, and I would totally sympathize with someone if they said, well, boy, that sounds really pretty aggressive or like reductionist or whatever. But hopefully over the course of this conversation, you can see a way in which there is a way in which that is actually pretty true. There's a way in which it's true that different kinds of ways of sense making and what they value and how they're going through the world, these form these auto-reproducible bundles of identity and stories and what have you, and power structures in the world. And there is this new one emerging, we would argue. But the work we're doing and the work that our colleagues in this worldview are doing sort of more broadly, it matters because these things do then get instantiated into, for example, the AIs that are going to raise your children in 10 years or raise your grandchildren in 30 years. This stuff matters for exactly this reason. These questions of identity, these questions of value, these questions of what metatheory are you using, and how is that then being put into social practice, and what kind of social initiatives are we creating to put our own best foot forward on some of these innovations. All of this stuff matters, and so I'd invite anybody that's listening to get involved with us, reach out, just continue to be a quiet observer and learner if they want. Like, we'll appreciate all of that. But yeah, it's really cool work, and I appreciate very much my colleagues here. I've learned so much from both of you, as well as many of our our friends in the Institute and around the field. It's an extraordinary gift to be able to work with you guys every day.
Thanks, man. Likewise. Yeah. Well said. I agree. This has been a wonderful conversation, and let's do it again sometime because an impressive amount got brought up here, and it's wonderful to have you not just as conversation partners, but as colleagues. And I'm really excited for all the incredible things that are going to come out of the Institute and the journal in 2026.
Absolutely. Yeah. Super grateful for both of you guys. It's just been incredible to work with you both and get, cultivate our friendships in the context of this calling to do this work together. And yeah, and I just want to underscore and reiterate what Rob said. Like, to anyone who's listening, if you feel any resonance with any aspect of this, like, we'd love for you to get involved. Reach out to us. We have an ongoing research forum that's, a deep dive and dialogue into these types of issues. And there's a lot of other contexts that you could get involved. So yeah, please do reach out.
And with
Thanks,
that, I
guys.
guess we'll all say goodbye. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And thanks, guys, for the last couple of hours. It's been great.
Godspeed.
Till next
Thank
time.
you.
Bye bye.
Thanks, guys.